Thank you so much for coming. I'm the curator of the Hillendar Research Library and the director of the Resource Center for Medieval Slavic Studies. And we're very happy that Dr. Clare Griffin was able to come and talk about her recent publication, Mixing Medicines. I ran down to the Hillendar Stacks to get our copy of the book and was so disappointed to see that it came without a cover, because one of my questions is about the izba, which is so wonderfully depicted on the cover. I mean, it's sort of reminiscent of, is it Mystical Max or Magic Max from The Princess Bride, their hut. So it was just sort of interesting in reading Claire's book about why the term izba is used. But first, a word from our sponsor. You will note that there is an exhibition dedicated to teaching with special collections from vault to classroom. There are a number of cases that have objects and items related to Slavic. There's architecture, there's Theater Research Institute and independent study. There's a case devoted to 25 years of the Medieval Slavic Summer Institute. But what is relevant today is the Medical Heritage Center's case, which is located in the gallery, because there is on display is both a bleeding bowl and a scarificator. I know you all will want to rush out after the lecture to take a look at it. The bleeding bowl, which is used in conjunction with a scarificator, of course, was used to collect a patient's blood, popular from the time of antiquity up to the 19th century. The scarificator, which is really, really scary, in fact, hence the name, it was a spring-loaded instrument with a series of 12 blades that snap out to cut the skin to allow for bloodletting. So operated by a physician, the scarificator was in use from the early 1700s into the early 1900s. And although I didn't see reference to those specific terms in Claire's book, she does mention bloodletting. Allow me to introduce our guest speaker. Clare Griffin is a British historian of Russia who completed her doctoral work at University College London and whose work has taken her to Russia, Germany, Kazakhstan, and now Bloomington, Indiana. She is an assistant professor for Russian history in the Department of History and the Robert F. Burns Russian and East European Institute, where she teaches courses on global history, colonialism, magic, and Kremlin memory politics. Dr. Griffin writes mental health advocacy and fiction alongside her academic work, and she's been published in Syracuse University's literary journal Word Gathering, the Times Higher Education Campus blog, among others. Her historical research focuses on knowledge, translation, and commodities in early modern Russian Empire. Her first book, Mixing Medicines, The Global Drug Trade in Early Modern Russia, was published by McGill-Queen's Press in 2022 and has been reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement. She is now working on her second book project on wounded soldiers and the history of war in a modern context. I would like to point out that in addition to the Times Literary Supplement, which is august in itself to stand alone, but interestingly enough, Clare has also had reviews in a variety of publications, including the Russian Review. Wait, I have the list. Well, and several medical journals. So
I think I may have to get your list of my reviews. I have a more complete list than I do.
Without further ado, Clare, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Pasha for the invitation and the very kind introduction. There is not a lot of bloodletting in the book, but there certainly was bloodletting at the Russian court. And if you did it properly, you got a little like party favor to go home. Like you bleed the Tsar successfully, you get, like an Oprah style thing. So we can talk a bit about bloodletting later if people want to. So mixing medicines, actually this up at the top, that's not an izba, it's a distilling piece of equipment. So it's in this version is from a Russian lichebnik, but it is taking Western European images. So, which is why if you look at the guy in particular, this is way more European, Western European, right? Okay, so this presentation, the start of the presentation is on this book, and then I have a few slides at the end on the new book project, so we can kind of decide if we want to take a break and finish talking, have questions about the old book, or go all the way through and talk about both at the same time. But we will see how people feel when we get there. So the first problem with a book talk is, how do you take this years of work and this rather long book and make it into one talk that takes a reasonable amount of time? Which button am I pressing is always the question. Here we go. So the way I try and do this is to ask the question, what would you do to heal yourself? Because everyone has a different answer to this. And what answer you give depends on various different factors. So let's look at a few factors from the modern world. So this from 2020, chlorine dioxide products have not been shown to be safe and effective for any use, including treatment of COVID-19. The Georgia, state of Georgia, not country of Georgia, Department of Public Health said adding chlorine dioxide are the active ingredients in disinfectants and have additional industrial uses. They are not meant to be swallowed by people. So this is an interesting one. When it comes to something people find really scary, people will often go to really extreme cures, whether or not they are approved by the medical establishment or not. So we have these kind of fringe treatments for COVID-19. You also have the very depressing cancer scam, where people will sell, to terminal cancer patients, people will try and sell anything, right? And they're often things which are very dangerous. If people are scared, if they are suffering from something very, very serious, they will often take something really extreme and something that may in itself be harmful in an attempt to treat this problem. So on the one hand, we are taking things that are pretty extreme sometimes in an attempt to heal ourselves. On the other hand, we have people turning down accepted mainstream medical treatments. So you mentioned blood. This is the other kind of blood, right? Has anyone seen these? These are real. You can get them off American hospital websites. If you won't have anyone else's blood or blood products, and some people bank their own blood and they'll just use their own blood, and some people won't take any blood products of any kind. These are legal forms. The inside is signed and it says, I understand the medical consequences of not accepting blood products. And this is for mostly for various Christian groups for whom taking blood is not religiously acceptable. But we have this is a mostly religiously based restriction on a commonly available and very widely accepted medical treatment. We're saying we won't have this. We would prefer to have the medical problem than to have this specific treatment. So here people are making a decision about rejecting a kind of medical document. But then we also have outside factors. I mean, this is the US, right? The US healthcare is nothing but external factors affecting how people can get healthcare. So this one from a branch of the UN, as of June 2022, 72% of people in high-income countries had been vaccinated with at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine, whereas only just under 18% of people in low-income countries have been vaccinated. The current status quo amounts to a system of, quote, vaccine apartheid. So this is one of the most extreme modern instances of structural inequalities making a massive difference to who can and cannot access certain kinds of treatments. And again, because we're in the US, I'm sure we can all think of lots and lots of other examples of where governments, pharmaceutical companies, international arrangements restrict what people can and cannot do. So what would you do to heal yourself? Anthropologists love to try and find something which was common to all human societies. And this issue of healing yourself is one of those questions which is universal. We don't always have the same answers, but we all have to ask the same questions. What are we prepared to do to make ourselves feel better? Are we prepared to follow any instruction from a mainstream doctor to get better? Are we prepared to take something that might make us feel much worse in the hopes that it will make us feel better? What kind of position have we been put in by society and governments that will restrict what we can and cannot have? So this is where it takes us to early modern Russia, because they also have to make exactly these kinds of choices. So what kind of sources do we have for early modern Russia? From around the late 16th century, certainly through to the first decade or so of the 18th century, we have a department in the Moscow court that what they do is provide medical treatment. It's mostly to the Tsar and his family and the courtiers, but they also do a few other things. They provide expert witness statements in witchcraft trials, as you do. They send medicaments to the army, a few other medically related things. One of the really notable things about the sources coming out of that department is the day-to-day stuff. Because if you're looking at trade, for example, what we often have are the big bulk things of trade, right? Through the port of Amsterdam, we moved 5 tons of cotton this year and things like this. And we often, in terms of medicine, have the theory of what's supposed to happen. So in theory, we are supposed to take 5 milligrams of mercury and we'll feel much better. This department has the nitty-gritty day-to-day. So as I'll show you guys later, we have the recipes, the medical recipes given to Tsar Mikhail Fyodorovich as he's dying. We don't really have that from anywhere else. We know these things happened, we know they existed, but we don't have them for anywhere else. So this is not just useful for knowing about early modern Russia, this is useful for anyone who's interested in pre-modern medicine, because we just don't have this kind of sources for almost anywhere else. I think most people in the room are not familiar with 17th century scotopies. You know, so this one is then, this is what most of these documents look like. They are scrolls, long documents. This department was mostly, the medics were mostly from Western Europe, and so they drafted things in Latin, and then you had the official translation into Russian, and you kept them in these long scrolls, and everything is stuck together. And this one, this actually is, this document later has something about bleeding, but this one talks about lekarstva. That word there is lekarstva, and we mention down here Brazilianie ljudi v Americe, nagi I bezknижni. So Brazilian people in America, naked and illiterate, and this is the British physician Samuel Collins, and he goes on to say, but still they found some good medical stuff, and that's interesting. So these are the kinds of sources I have coming out of these, this particular department. And you can see here, this document immediately drops us into medical drugs in particular. So this is the focus of the book, is this department's use of medical drugs and what it tells us. What opportunities did the 17th century Moscow court have? So there was this kind of interminable argument for several decades about, well, is Russia cut off from the world in this period? And the answer really is no. And we can see it in these kinds of documents. What opportunities does the Russian court have? Is it hemmed in by other things, or can they make their own choices? So we can look at a few things here. This has to do with unicorns. So unicorn horn in this period was very popular for various things. It came to have an association as something that would be proof against poison, and so it's used as a prophylactic. It is mostly actually, I think I have a picture here, yeah, narwhal horn. And so you can actually see that's a real narwhal horn. You can see that these are similar. The King of Denmark is running a scam in this period, selling what he knows full well to be narwhal tusks as unicorn horn. And today you can see the unicorn horn throne of Denmark, just to be like, this is how we made our money. We know that the Russian court at some points owned multiple of these things. So the economics of unicorns is very interesting. I love PowerPoint design suggestions. It's a great investigation of AI capabilities. So these are some of the graphics are PowerPoint. So this is one from Western Europe. 1597, the Republic of Venice was offered the chance to buy a unicorn horn for 30,000 ducats. So then we have to question, well, how much is a ducat? Approximately 3.5 grams of gold. I made this PowerPoint September last year, I think, at which point you had about $62 US dollars to the gram of gold. So the approximate price of that unicorn horn is lots and lots and lots and lots of money. So like I said, at one point, the Moscow court has several of these. They're dropping the contemporary equivalent of millions on these unicorn horns. So one thing which we know determines access to medical treatment is money. The Moscow court does not have that problem in the 17th century. If we want to buy it, we have the money, we will spend we will get this thing. There is nothing in these records indicating that they turn down something because of the price. So they are really able to get hold of anything of any level of expense that's available in this period. We also need to consider geography. So this is one of my favorite maps of the Russian Empire. This is 1745. Contemporary note, down here in the corner is the Black Sea. That's the Crimea. Crimea, of course, not part of the Russian Empire at this point, not until the 1780s. But if we look at this geography and think about importing medical objects, we have access to Western Europe, and we know we bring in techniques and books and doctors from there. We also have links down south into the various markets of Central Asia, into Iran, and we also have access to East Asia and to China. So we really have good access to Western Europe and a lot of Asia through the colonial conquests of the Russian Empire. And we can see this geographical diversity in what we have. So this is one of the things that fails to save Mikhail Fyodorovich. Again, this is a PowerPoint design suggestion. The divisions here into roots, herbs, and flowers are in the documents. And you'll note if you read through them, that doesn't make sense which one is which. So you can see up the top, we see 6 zolotniki. So a zolotnik is a weight that you use for small things like jewels and precious metals. And we can see various different kinds of things coming up. We have parsley up at the top. We have wormwood in here, rose, and various things that you may or may not recognize. And we end with some German wine specifically, which is to be mixed with unspecified herbs and roots. So see, sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. It looks like it's worked today. So if we go to the red boxes from the bottom upwards, so juniper berries, we're going to have 6 zolotniki of juniper berries. The botanical life of Afro-Eurasia is very annoying for historians of botany and historians of herbal medicine because lots of things grow all over the place. And also, as we will see in a minute, botany has changed since the 17th century. We know from other documents, these specific juniper berries, although we could source them for various places, there is a peasant tribute of juniper berries that they bring to the Moscow court, mostly from Yaroslavl. And they bring in all these juniper berries. So this particular one, we're pretty confident that part of this recipe is from the historical lands of Muscovy. And there's a few other things in here which might be from around there. Things like rosemary, rose, parsley, wormwood, all possibly could be from the Russian Empire, and particularly the western part of the Russian Empire. But we also have a bunch of things in here that come from further away. So ones you might be familiar with are things like cinnamon. So cinnamon in here, we have in other ones nutmeg, and those are East Asian things in particular. And East and South Asian. Rhubarb is interesting because people think they know what rhubarb is, and they don't, unless you're a historian of Central Asian trade, in which case you will have read this thing. What we have is not what they had. Rhubarb, initially, they could not work how to transplant it, and so they were importing the root of rhubarb from East Asia, and that was the thing in Western Europe for certain kinds of treatment was Chinese rhubarb. So we know from context that's from China, and we see other things in here like cinnamon that's also going to be from Asia. Alexandrine senna, so senna again grows various places. The word Alexandrine means it might be North African. And then the interesting one up at the top here is sassafras. Do we have sassafras in Ohio? Yeah. So this is the same thing. So I ended up writing a whole article on sassafras because, again, the botanical history of that and the history of the names of sassafras get complicated. This sassafras is the North American sassafras tree. And that is confusing in terms of the geography and history of Russian interactions with the Americas. The story says that in the early 18th century, the Russian Academy of Sciences is sailing across what is now the Bering Sea, and they see some islands in the distance, and this turns out to be the islands off the coast of what is now Alaska. And so, in theory, the Russians go to the Americas across the Pacific in the early 18th century, and we don't really have a lot to do with Americas before that. Partly because tobacco, the more famous American commodity, is banned in Russia for the 17th century. We actually see a very different story if we look at the medical commodities, and this one here, black Michoacán, I think is how it's pronounced. That one is from the area of modern-day Mexico. This sassafras was most likely from Spanish-controlled Florida. So this is another one where I had to work back through other documents and say, who is in control of this plant? Who is bringing it into Western Europe? So what we have is sassafras growing in Spanish-controlled Florida, being brought into the Spanish ports, going on to Amsterdam, London, and Hamburg, and then being brought in via Archangel down to Moscow. So here, 1645, we are importing a couple of different American medical products into Moscow, and this is products coming basically from as far away as you can get in the 17th century, because we haven't found Australia yet. But things coming from Florida to Moscow, in theory, this doesn't happen, right? Like, we're not supposed to be bringing things from Florida to Moscow really at all, certainly not in 1645. So looking at the botanical geography of what we have in these very day-to-day recipes of stuff we know they had and we know they are using gives us this view of Moscow's connections. And their connections really are global. If they want something from basically anywhere, they can source it. So that is the opportunities of the Russian court. We have this huge empire, which means we can source all of these things from across the empire. We have these huge financial resources, so we can buy almost anything we want. And we have these various diplomatic and trade and medical contexts, meaning that we can bring in medical commodities from a huge range of locations. So the Moscow court has very few restrictions in terms of external restrictions on what they can and can't do medically. But we see a very different view when we consider, well, how might they be restricting themselves? So interestingly, we have to go to icons. So the significant thing here is to look at, wow. Yeah. If you look at the torso and the arms of Christ, he has very thin arms, and unfortunately, he kind of does look slightly ripped in this photo, but he's not supposed to look like he's been down the CrossFit gym. He's supposed to look emaciated and very thin. I'm told modern Korean Jesus is often super ripped, like he is CrossFit Jesus. But this depiction of Jesus is supposed to be of someone who is very thin. So that one is a 16th century crucifixion icon. And this is Avakon Petrov, notorious religious extremist from the 17th century. And he gives a classic Avakon Petrov-esque quote here. Look at the holy icons and see how pleasing they are to God, how the good icon painters express their semblance. Face, hand, nose, and all the senses are fine and emaciated by fasting and their suffering. But now you have changed their semblance and paint them as you yourselves are, with fat bellies, round faces, hands and feet like fatty dumplings. And this does reflect something that we see in icon history in this period. You do change, you see changes in the physical aspects of saints and of Jesus. So Petrov takes this position about the correct state of the human body, because religions commonly do have a stance on this, especially if you're in a religion with a creator God, then God is setting what the human body should look like. And that tells us a lot about how we should consume things, what we should consume things. Petrov's focus here is that you should consume the absolute minimum to sustain life. You are supposed to really just be getting by. And this fits into various other things we see from him, that life is about suffering and we shouldn't be kind of trying to make it nicer for ourselves. And so this is one view of the correct human body, and a view which contradicts or clashes with medical views from the same period. And we can see that in some foreign accounts. So this is the famous British diplomat Giles Fletcher, writing in the late 16th century, and he says, they, the Russians, make a difference of meat and drinks, according the use of one to be more holy than another. And therefore in their set fasts they forbear to eat flesh and white meats, as we call them, after the manner of the popish superstition, Catholicism, which they observe so strictly and with such blind devotion, as that they will rather die than eat one bit of flesh, eggs, or such like, for the health of their bodies in their extreme sickness. So this is a very interesting quote. This is about food, but it's also about medicine. So what should you do if a medicine includes something that you do not wish to consume? So you could think about certain medicines are inappropriate for vegans, for example. What do you do then? Do you break your normal mode of consumption to take the medicine, or do you refuse to take the medicine because it would break that mode of consumption? Interestingly, Judaism takes the totally opposite view to this. You have to break whatever restrictions they are if it would save someone's life, whereas Fletcher here claims it's the total opposite in 17th century Russian Orthodox Christianity. You cannot break the fasting rules. It would be better to die than to break the rules of fasting. We tend to get complaints like this from the Western European medical doctors at the Russian court. According to the data from people like Darra Goldstein and Julia Hertzberg, fast days in this period take up between 180 and 220 days of the year. This is pretty substantial, right? Like, this isn't like once a week we're fasting. This is a really, really big restriction on what we can do. So although we're not getting external restrictions, we're getting really significant internal restrictions. And we then also see this in the Russian documents themselves. So this again is this medical department. If you come and work in this specific medical department in any capacity, you have to swear an exceptionally long oath, including this section. I pledge not to spoil patients' health with any kind of affair, nor with any kind of cunning, and not to give an evil herbal root, not to put unclean mumia, nor any evil snake poison, nor other poisonous animal, nor reptile, nor bird, nor any evil and unclean compound that could harm health into medicines, and to watch vigilantly over my colleagues in preparing all concoctions and in all measures which are created for the Tsar's health, so that they, my colleagues, do not put into those concoctions anything bad, nor substitute an evil herb for a good. There's a lot going on. So like I said, this is one paragraph of a much longer oath, and it is very heavily fixated on medicines in particular. So they are doing bloodletting. We don't have a lot of bloodletting in these oaths, even though bloodletting is inherently very dangerous. So what do we have in here? So to spoil patients' health, if you're familiar with the witchcraft documents, spoil is a word that we also use to mean bewitch. Cunning is also a word that gets used as a synonym for witchcraft. So we have an association here between bad medicine and malefic magic. And then we have a few things that you guys may not recognize. So we do have this list of animals and reptiles and things like this. So that relates to the thing that Charles Fletcher says about restrictions on flesh. So in this period, there are various flesh-based medicines, and given Russian Orthodox fasting customs and general food restrictions, that becomes a problem, right? If you restrict certain kinds of meat products, medicines based on meat products become tricky. Unclean mumia and evil snake poison. So unclean is nechisti. This isn't like dirty, it's like ritually unclean. It's almost kind of supernaturally unclean. Mumia, mummy you see in various things, was a real thing you could buy in this period for reasons to do with terrible translation. This is kind of a wonderful object lesson for why translation is important. One sec. Dramatic pause. Ancient world recipes recommended a particular kind of substance that had been used to produce mummies. Bad translations led people to believe that it was actually the mummies themselves that was the important ingredient. So by the early modern period, Western Europeans start grave robbing Egypt. Yeah, this is one of the reasons we lost so many Egyptian mummies, because the Western Europeans are stealing them and grinding them up to use in medicines. This is a little bit controversial in early modern Western Europe, but it is pretty widely used. So we can see why this fits into this and into other Russian ideas, right? Like, We're not allowed to eat certain kinds of meat. We're definitely not allowed to eat other humans. So clearly, we don't have the background to this, but it looks like at some point a Western European medic has said, we have this great stuff. It's ground up human flesh. And the Russian court has said, under no circumstances. We then have next to this even same stranger phrase, evil snake poison. So this is zloy, it is evil. There is another even more widely used medicine in early modern Europe at this time period, theriac or teriac, again, an ancient world medicine that its ingredients really got mangled through multiple decades, centuries of translation. And by this period, they think that you should put viper flesh in it, which was thought to be poisonous. And the Venetians in particular have a very elaborate viper flesh creation ritual. So we can see here the world of medicines that we live here in terms of the restrictions we make. These are not mundane restrictions based on something like efficacy. This is moral, this is religious, this is supernatural. We have very, very strong feelings about all of this. And a lot of what we have strong feelings about is flesh-based medicines, the ones that Giles Fletcher told us the Russians are concerned about. So these are our local restrictions. So in terms of the global possibilities of the Russian court, they can get all kinds of things. They can source things if they want to bring things in from Venice or China or North Africa or London or Spanish-controlled Florida. They have the financial resources and the opportunities to bring this stuff in. So they're not really restricted from outside, but they put substantial restrictions on themselves and on the people who work for them. And those restrictions are about religion. They are about a version of Christianity which says this is what the human body should look like, and we cannot deviate from that. And it is better for us to die following the rules than break the rules and live. So this is a history of the global drug trade and early modern Russia, where globalization kind of gets its ass kicked by the early modern Russian rules. We're used to this idea where globalization steamrolls local culture, right? Whereas here, we have all these global possibilities, but they are stamped on by this local culture which says you can only be here if you follow our rules. So that is the first book. I do have some slides on the next big project, but so should I continue or should we take questions here and then go to the next book? Okay.
I'd like to know what was the objection to that?
That is Matt Romanello's.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, he goes back and forth. So at one point he says it's cultural, and then he's also worried about the economics. So because initially tobacco is being grown only by other empires, there's a big economic problem, right? And this is one of the reasons that the European empires want to colonize North America, because it means they get hold of things you can't get elsewhere. So it's tobacco, it's sassafras. There's a few other medical ones. Sarsaparilla is very popular. South American silver and gold is the kind of stereotypical one, right? The empires are moving into these regions in order to gain a monopoly over certain things. So one of the things that Matt has said is that this might be about not wanting to give, at that point, the British all this money. There is a cultural problem. Things coming in from the Americas present a problem for Leviticus, because in theory, Leviticus tells us all of the things we should eat and drink. But tobacco isn't listed in there, coffee isn't listed in there, tea isn't listed in there. So are we allowed to smoke and eat and drink all of these things? Different religions and different branches of Christianity take different standpoints. Certainly there are significant resistance to tobacco in certain religious communities. There's a wonderful book of folk tales about the origins of certain plants and animals. And it says, I believe on tobacco, it says that it grew first from the heart of a dead prostitute. So it has these very negative connotations. The same collection says that potatoes were the thing that Adam and Eve ate that got them kicked out of Eden. So we had a lot of feelings about American plants in particular. So those are the two options. Is this, or to rather perhaps, to what extent is this about, we don't like this new stuff coming over? To what extent is it, we don't want to give all this money to the British? Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because part of this, if you look at the list of medicaments, you get this very global view of all of these things are coming in, but the geography of the prescription of this and the regulation of medicine is really tightly focused on central Moscow. So, if we think the Kremlin is over here, the Apothecary Chancery is initially in the Kremlin, and then it's a little bit up the road. One of the buildings is just behind the Lenin Library, for people who know where that is. And then Kitai-Gorod is, so we have the Kremlin here, Apothecary Chancery, Red Square, Kitai-Gorod over here. And Kitai-Gorod is one of the places that you get, it's a merchant circle, right? And so, like you say, in the book, I talk about the fact that certain of those market traders get pulled in for illegal trading in medicines. But that must also have been one of the places that they are buying their day-to-day supplies. So there is a relationship between the Kitai-Gorod traders who are trading in things like plants and the Apothecary Chancery, and we know that they are using those markets to buy supplies, but they also get upset when the markets try and sell certain kinds of things. So it is, you can partly see this as kind of a micro history of this very, very central Moscow, where we have a surprising number of people selling and making and using medicines that are in complicated interactions, which are not always very positive for each other.
So, the British obviously are adversaries.
Sure.
The Dutch would be.
Yeah, it depends which period you're in, but yeah.
So you've got the London and Amsterdam projector, you could say.
Yeah.
Then there's the Volga down to Astrakhan.
Yeah.
Then I'm thinking Ilya Vinkovensky near Chin, we're at the end of the 17th.
Sure.
How complicated, and as we move into the 18th century, then the overland connection. So if the Astrakhan, that's a Persian connection, but it's also an Ottoman.
Yeah.
Right. How complicated does this get as you build out?
Yeah, it is interesting. So again, medicines, we have a lot of concern over this because we're putting it inside ourselves, right? It's not like we're buying pelts of fur or bolts of silk or something. It's something we plan to put inside ourselves. And there is a mirroring here between the staff of the Apothecary Chancery and the supplies of the Apothecary Chancery. We almost exclusively get them from our diplomatic allies in Western Europe. So you get a little bit about Indian traders bringing in certain things, but ludicrously, so nutmeg is in this period exclusively growing in what is now, so it's the Spice Islands, right? So it's Southeast Asia, but it's coming in via Amsterdam and Hamburg. So it's doing this, which is obviously ridiculous. So it's this stamp on the world of our trusted links. We are only going to buy medical supplies from people we like. So we're less likely to get them from the Ottomans, for example. Interestingly, the Dutch, I have an article that just came out this week. In the early 18th century, there was a Dutch translation of a little trading book for foreigners in Russia. And one of the things it has is a tariff book of things we think we're going to trade often enough to be worth writing down the usual price, right? And in the Dutch translation, they rearranged the listings in the tariff book to have a subsection on drugs. And it says, these are all the things. And that subsection doesn't exist in the Russian original. So that they have the prices from the Russian original, but they made a subsection because drugs are great for trading because there is a huge price for weight advantage, right? Like you fill the hold of your ship with nutmegs, because nutmeg is outrageously expensive in this period, you're making way more than if you fill it with cotton or something, right? Yeah, so it really does come in primarily from Western Europe in this period because they trust the Western Europeans more than they trust the Qing and the Ottomans. Usually the second one, right? Yeah. So this one is interesting for this. So we don't usually have the debate, right, where we have someone proposes something and the courtiers talk about this, because so much of this is happening in the spoken words. So the Tsar and his council, there aren't kind of minutes from those, right? They will just discuss things and you just get the end product. So if we get that line where we see don't put unclean mimea and evil snake poison, at some point they've had a conversation about this where someone proposes it and they discuss what it is and a decision is made. We do know when we see certain medicines being edited, and also when we see some of the reports that the department produces also sometimes get edited between the Latin and the Russian. It is the administrators, the Russian noble administrators come in and are like, we don't like this. So, and this is actually something the Western European medics also complain about. They say, well, we came here with all of our fancy knowledge and now you won't listen to us. I think is very relatable, right? And so it is definitely the Russian court bureaucracy making these decisions. Is it going to be the Tsar himself? He's probably involved in the conversations, but this is partly about politics, right? Like the death of a Tsar is a political problem. So you're going to get all of these other courtiers who are going to weigh in some way. So we know these conversations are happening. We don't usually see them. If there is a question over a medicine, it's definitely not going to be tried out on the member of the royal family first. We're going to give it to like a soldier or something, right? The only time, so drug trials in this period are very common. You test out your medicines. The only time I've seen this happen in Russia is unicorn horn. There is a series of experiments described in various books for how to establish the veracity of your very expensive unicorn horn. You should poison some kittens or some doves. And you have to have 3 of them. So it's almost like a modern experiment of you give them different versions, right? I can't remember which is the right way, but one of them only gets poison. One of them gets unicorn horn and then poison, and one of them gets poison and then unicorn horn. And one of those last 2 are supposed to be the only ones to survive, right? And I forget which one. That is the only case in which the Russians test out one of their medicines is by, I think in their case, they poison some doves rather than some kittens. But so we very occasionally in Russia have like animal testing, right, for our medicines. We certainly don't test things out on the Tsar if we're not quite sure if we have the right kind of unicorn horn.
When you're talking about prescriptions, the quote, which I love, is they're not about what to treat, but who to blame.
Yes, which is true today, right?
But also, I was wondering, with the names of all these herbs and so forth, do they ever sort of slip in sort of recipes for cooking, or give additional directions as how these ingredients can be used?
Yeah. So for people who haven't read the book, so these are very fulsome because it's the Tsar. We have a lot of much shorter ones, and for example, for the shorter ones, sometimes they won't even tell us what we're treating because we don't care what we're treating. We care that X guy made the thing, so if it goes wrong, it was his fault. Do we have other things in here? So they are very, very pissy about mixing up ingredients, right? Like we're not allowed to substitute even things which are fine for other things if we said we were going to use the other thing. In this one and in some of the other longer ones, you do get, this should be taken with fish soup. And so it's a diet in the medieval ancient world sense of a diet. In the case of a kind of an entire regime of being, this guy is put into really strict circumstances for the last few weeks of his life, where it's like, well, you're only drinking this kind of wine and you have to take this kind of soup with these kinds of things. And so when we are treating courtiers, we will often have that kind of a health food regime going alongside our official medical drug regime. But we do distinguish between this is lekarstva, this is concocted medicine, versus this is food. Lekarstva, which we will recognize as the modern Russian word for medicine, that doesn't exist in the 16th century. That comes into being during the 17th century as we get a concept of medicine as something which is a combination of things, as opposed to like lichebnia, so like healing things. Okay, book 2. Okay, we will flip through. Okay, new project. Much more depressing than eating human flesh. Yeah, you're welcome. The same department has a collection of really creepy descriptions of wounded Russian soldiers. So these guys are absolutely no one. This is not the Tsar. This is not even a general. It's just these random soldiers. And they are weirdly detailed. So this one, we have, 1673, this guy is shot specifically by a musket into his right leg around the secret strings. This is uptight Muscovite for groin. It is not possible to treat this, and if we were to begin the treatment, that would lead to his death. And he is infirm and decrepit, and it is not possible for him to serve the Tsar. So there's a substantial collection of these, and they are, this is very typical. We are often interested in firearms wounds. We have a really unnecessarily detailed description of the wound. And our sole real interest is, can they continue military service? And sometimes you'll actually get the questions. You have 3 questions. Are they really injured or sick? Can we treat them? If we treat them, can they serve the Tsar? There is almost never any mention of pain. There is often no mention of whether we bothered to treat them or not. We really don't care at all about these guys, but we do care about their injuries. So this is a very strange collection of documents that kind of takes us somewhere significant in terms of kind of the everyday bodily consequences of empire, right? Like empire is about violent expansion. Guys like the unfortunate Simeon are taking the brunt of these actions. There's also something, as I was going through and looking at, well, precisely where and when are these documents on wounded soldiers happening. Something very strange occurred. So this is an article that's going to come out shortly in Russian history. And this is the start of my abstract for this. In the first 2 weeks of August, 535 Russian soldiers were seriously wounded in eastern Ukraine. The year was 1678. So Russia is fighting all kinds of wars in this period and in the period that the Apothecary Chancery is acting, and we have descriptions of dealing with the army, medically supplying the army from at least the 1630s through into kind of the 1710s. And yet these documents on wounded soldiers we primarily have from the very end of the 17th century into the very early 18th century, and they relate to the first Russo-Turkish War, 1678 to 81, and then the southern bit of the Great Northern War, which is very strange because at a time when, of course, there is a huge conflict right now in this region, they're fighting in places like Chihirin, which is about 300 kilometers from the present front. So it would be difficult anyway to write about war in this time of war, but there is this kind of urgent geography where we can't not talk about this elephant in the room of these conflicts have weirdly ended up being in the same place. So they have the kind of the original problem of the project, which is why do we care about gunshot wounds on very low rank soldiers? But then the extra layer of how do you write about this in the present context that acknowledges what's going on without it being some kind of clickbait, remember there's a war, also I wrote this kind of thing. So this is the new project, is trying to deal with these very strange little documents and contemplate it in the current context. So like I said, much more depressing than eating human flesh. Questions on this one? Expressions of horror?
Why they're so
One of the things that I've been thinking about is that this may be a very crude form of spying, because we would like to know what the military capacity of the enemy is. So different kinds of firearms leave different traces. So actually, I've been reading a certain amount of modern forensics books, but modern firearms leave completely different wounds than these kind of firearms, because modern firearms fire the projectile much faster, and the projectile tends to fragment as well. Whereas these are almost like tiny, tiny blunt force injuries. And so they sometimes claim they know, was this a carbine, was this a musket? So they really are fixated on firearms over everything else. You would expect to see a fair amount of edged weapon injuries, right? Like we're still just hitting people with swords in this period. You see very few of those. You see lots, and by far the most common kind of wound that I see in these documents is musket wounds. So yeah, maybe we're interested in what capacities the enemy has. Yeah. Yeah, so sometimes you have an indication of what could be friendly fire because you get a lot of so we have lists of people who have just been in the battle and they're injured. We have petitions for treatment or demands for people to be treated later. And then for certain big conflicts, you then have people requesting to retire because they were injured. And in the initial lists, you will sometimes get people listed as burnt by powder. And that sounds like it could be something like a cannon misfiring and exploding. Like that's one way you could have it. We do have occasional mentions of definite accidents. One guy writes in his own petition, or he explains it to the clerk who writes it down, and he says his musket exploded in his hands. which would have happened a lot because we know things get miscast, but also in this period, these are muzzle loading things where you're hand pouring the gunpowder. If you think about, you know, there's a battle, it's loud, there's clouds of smoke because all of these weapons produce huge amounts of smoke. You're not really having a good day. You're trying to hand measure how much gunpowder to put in this already used weapon to drop the ball in to then fire it. So that must have been a really nasty injury, right? Like it's going to be your arms, and it may well have also been his face, right? So we definitely do have accidents. Soldiers in this period are also kind of a police force, kind of also the firefighters as well. So you also get them injured in various other ways. That's one of the things I'm trying to figure out from some of these documents is some of them definitely are accidents, but then there's kind of this intriguing middle ground of, is this an accident or not? Because some of them aren't exactly clear. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But any evidence of mental?
Yeah. So in this period, you're not using this idea of mental illness. It's dushevnaya болезнь. It's like a soul sickness. Yeah. And so those guys, anyone who is labeled as that, typically goes to a monastery instead. There is one very strange document of a guy who is sent for examination in the apothecary department and for excessive masturbation. And that gets sent there. It is suggested that that is the issue of witchcraft. Other than that, anything that we might contemplate to be mental illness tends to go to a religious setting. This is another significant thing in these documents is what do we see in terms of people being wounded? Typically, it is wounds to the limbs. Because they can't do these lists really, really immediately. They're doing this, you know, it's going to be at least a few hours, maybe the next day after battle. If you have a substantial wound to the torso or the head, you're already going to be dead by this point. If you have a minor wound, no one's paying attention to anyway. So there is a patterning of the body as well in terms of what gets injured. So things like a brain injury, either it's not going to be significant enough to see it, or it's going to be classified as a spiritual issue. We send you to the monastery, or you're dead. So that kind of things, this issue of things like shell shock, just doesn't come up in this kind of document because of the context in which they're produced.
Is this a time period for fixed bayonets on muskets?
I have to look into all of this. I think that fixed bayonets may be slightly later. This is another thing I have to look into is kind of reading into the specifics of firearms in this period because they're really changing a lot across this period. And then you read certain things about the history of firearms technology and certain things that you read and you're like, oh, well, actually, I can see that this is obviously true, but I hadn't thought of it before. Flintlock muskets don't work in the rain. Because you've got to set it on fire. And so this then, you know, you have to consider the meteorological side of battles. Another thing as to why we're interested in them serving the Tsar is that fighting is very physical. Firearms are initially very, very inaccurate. One of the reasons armies may be moving from bows to firearms is that they require much less physicality. Anyone who's used a bow knows that it's a lot of effort to pull it back. It is much less effort to fire a firearm, but it still requires a fair amount of dexterity and strength and endurance capacity to be doing this over several hours. So it's about, one of the things we see here is this idea of what is the appropriate physical capacity for a soldier, presuming that they're going to be using things like firearms.
Brian Davies has some interesting work on Russian military history.
Yeah.
The 17th century specifically.
Yeah.
A very deliberate watershed moment where central decision to move away from traditional modes of focus on, despite the fact that they.
Yeah,
They're focusing on that.
yeah, absolutely.
I think his argument is telling that it's, in manpower, it's, got a bunch of peasants who are not trained as
Yeah.
warriors, who don't have the physique that
Yeah.
is required over decades of raised pastoral nomadic environment where archery is military, it's hunting, it's everything.
Yeah.
And you can take these guys, yeah, I mean, you're right, that it's very taxing, it's challenging work.
Yeah.
It's farming, but you can take somebody who's a farmer and
Yeah.
in a few weeks. build it.
Yeah.
Whereas, it takes a lifetime of training to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the technology of building those bows as well.
Yeah, it's difficult.
That can
Yeah.
take months.
Yeah.
You know, or even years.
Yeah.
Right? The Mongolian recurve bows. are-
Yeah.
Even somebody like Titus.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been reading a lot of his work, and yeah, what he says makes a lot of sense. Like you say, you can train someone to be basically competent with a musket much faster than with a bow. I'm not going to be able to remember her name off the top of my head, but one of our Ukrainianists over at IU took a 3-day course in using an AK-47 to see, well, how fast can you pick this up? And in the current war, both sides are heavily relying on the success of that. I think it's the 74, but it's another AK. And she was saying, yes, you can pick this up, but it's still pretty difficult. They're very heavy. You're having to move them around very quickly. And so even just 3 days training, which is what a lot of these guys get, it will get you to a basic level of competence, but it's still a struggle to get to a point where you're actually effective in just defending yourself, let alone really participating in a battle. But yeah, the physical aspects of why armies change which weapons to use is definitely a big kind of issue to think about.
Year by year, decade by decade.
Yeah.
There's some freaking Ottoman history.
The Gabor, yeah. Also have been reading. Yeah. Well, we can swap reading lists. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and there's another avenue to potentially go down is this issue from the history of technology, which is object agency. So one of the classic articles on this says, consider a water pump. You know, it's an object, but it's only an object that is itself when it's doing its thing. You have to take it out of its box and install it correctly in the correct location and be using it and maintaining it. And it's not really the water pump unless you're doing that. And again, if you think about something like an AK-47, this is not a hunting rifle. Assault rifles are for killing people. And so really that kind of firearm is only itself when it is loaded, when it's being held by someone who fully intends to use it, and it is being fired towards other human beings. Like that is the moment in which it fulfills its purpose. And so thinking about that kind of thing in terms of the history of firearms technology, I think potentially takes us somewhere interesting as well, because again, it fits into this physicality, right? A human who is capable and trained to use this technology is a fundamental part of that history of technology. Yeah. Yeah.
This paper, or they talk about this.
Yeah, from the phrasing of this, I would guess that this means it's quite close to the groin and you have very major blood vessels in your groin area, right? So it's possible they think that trying to remove the bullet or take the leg off is just going to cause too much bleeding. Very little description of the treatments. They only care if we can get this guy back in service. We really don't care about the specifics of it. So this is again the interesting specificities of these documents. What do we care about? What do we not care about? First of all, we don't care about them being in pain. We almost never mention that. And we don't care about what are we going to do to treat them. You know, just it's like if you are not a car person and you take your car to the mechanic and the mechanic's like, well, I'm going to do this and this. And you're like, I don't care. Make it go vroom again. That's all I'm interested in here. Like, this is the attitude of the Russian administrators towards the soldiers, is can we make them do the thing we want them to do? Yes or no? Like, that's where the administrative interest ends. So we don't know. Yeah. Yeah. So certainly they must have been doing amputations, if you just to probably to save people's lives, but they would not be interested in amputations because, like you say, in this period, it's not going to put someone back in this kind of service. One of the things, you do have these big books of how to deal with firearms, like the French guy Ambrose Paré, I want to say his name is pronounced, but he does a lot of things on the battlefield. So it's things like, can we burn wounds to close them up and things like this. But yeah, I would expect they are less interested in amputation for what you said, like, because it doesn't get them to the place where the Russian administrators want to be.
Well, let's thank Claire. She's here all weekend. Case you have other questions.
Thank you.